Man is condemned to be free, because once thrown into the world, he is responsible for everything he does. Every decision you have ever made to keep someone else comfortable at the cost of your own peace, every time you swallowed what you actually thought to avoid conflict, every version of yourself you performed for an audience that never asked for the real one, all of it traces back to the same problem. Yet there is a name for what you're doing, and a French philosopher identified it over 80 years ago as the single greatest betrayal a human being can commit against themselves. Because Jean Paul Sartre argued that the most dangerous prison a human being can live in is not built from circumstance. It is built from the choices you make to become what everyone else needs you to be. Jean Paul Sartre was born in Paris in 1905. He was small, cross-eyed, and by his own admission profoundly ugly. He grew up without a father, raised by his mother and her parents, and from an early age he was acutely aware of how other people perceived him, and how much that perception shaped the way he moved through the world. He was not popular in the conventional sense. He was too strange, too intense, too preoccupied with questions that made other people uncomfortable. And yet he became one of the most read, most argued about, and most genuinely provocative thinkers of the 20th century. He did not set out to write a philosophy of self-help. He set out to understand the fundamental nature of human existence, what it means to be a conscious being in a world that did not ask for your presence, and offers no predetermined instructions for what to do with it. And in that investigation, which consumed decades of his life, and produced some of the densest and most rewarding philosophical writing ever put to paper, he arrived at something that most people spend their entire lives trying not to look at directly. The human being, Sartre argued, is unlike every other thing that exists. A rock is a rock. It has no choice about what it is or what it does. An animal operates largely from instinct, from biological drives that determine its behavior without anything resembling deliberation. But a human being is something different entirely. A human being is consciousness, and consciousness, by its very nature, is always free. Not free in the shallow sense of being able to do whatever you want whenever you want, but free in a much more fundamental and much more terrifying sense. Free in the sense that there is no fixed nature you were born with that determines who you are. Free in the sense that you're not your past, not your upbringing, not your circumstances, not the role other people have assigned to you. Free in the sense that at every single moment of your existence you are choosing who you are through what you do. And nothing, no force, no person, no institution, no amount of social pressure can remove that freedom from you. Sartre called this radical freedom, and he believed it was the defining feature of human existence. Not a gift to be celebrated, but a condition to be reckoned with. Because with that freedom comes a responsibility so total, so absolute, that most people will spend their entire lives running from it. Here is where it gets personal, and where the concept of bad faith enters. If you are radically free, if there is no fixed nature that determines who you must be, then every version of yourself you present to the world is a choice. Every role you play is a role you chose to play. Every limitation you claim as permanent is a limitation you have decided to accept. And every time you tell yourself that you have no choice, that you must be this way because of where you came from, or what people expect of you, or what your circumstances demand, you are lying. Not maliciously, not consciously in most cases, but lying nonetheless. Lying to yourself about the nature of your own freedom. Pretending to be a thing rather than a consciousness. Pretending that your identity is fixed and given rather than chosen and constructed in every moment. This is what Sartre called bad faith. Mauvaise foi in French. The act of deceiving yourself about your own freedom, of choosing to believe that you have no choice, of collapsing the infinite openness of what you could be into the narrow, safe, socially acceptable version of yourself that other people have come to expect. And the reason people do it is not stupidity. It is not weakness in the conventional sense. It is because freedom is genuinely terrifying. If you are truly free, then there is nothing to blame for the life you are living except the choices you have made and continue to make. There is no circumstance that forced you. There is no person who made you this way. There is no predetermined destiny that put you here. There is only you, making choices constantly whether you acknowledge that or not. Bad faith is the escape hatch from that terror. It is the story you tell yourself that removes your responsibility for your own life by convincing you that you are not the author of it. Sartre illustrated bad faith with one of the most famous examples in all of 20th century philosophy, a waiter in a Paris cafe. This waiter, Sartre observed, moves with a precision that is just slightly too perfect. His posture is just slightly too straight. His tone is just slightly too formal. His movements are just slightly too deliberate. He is not simply doing his job. He's being a waiter. He has collapsed his entire identity into the role. He has decided that what he is, fundamentally and completely, is a waiter. Not a person who works as a waiter. A waiter. Full stop. And in that collapse, Sartre argued, he is in bad faith, because the waiter is not a waiter the way a stone is a stone. He chose to take this job. He could choose to leave it. He has opinions and desires and an inner life that have nothing to do with the cafe. But by performing the role so completely, by identifying himself so totally with what other people expect of him in this context, he has denied all of that. He has made himself into a thing, a function, a role, rather than a consciousness that is always more than any role it inhabits. Now pause and consider how much of your own life looks like that waiter. How many roles are you performing with that same slightly too deliberate precision? The dutiful child, the reliable employee, the agreeable friend, the person who never makes waves, never asks for too much, never shows the parts of themselves that might make other people uncomfortable. How much of what you call your personality is actually a performance that was so consistently rewarded that you eventually forgot it was a performance at all? That is the insidious depth of bad faith. It does not stay on the surface. Given enough time and enough reinforcement, the performance becomes the only self you know. The mask and the face become indistinguishable, and the authentic self, the one that existed underneath all of it, becomes so quiet and so buried that most people genuinely cannot hear it anymore. Sartre distinguished bad faith from simple lying because in a lie, you know the truth and choose to conceal it from someone else. In bad faith, you conceal it from yourself. You are simultaneously the deceiver and the deceived. You construct a version of reality in which your freedom does not exist, in which you have no choice, in which the role you are playing is not a role but simply what you are. And then you live inside that construction so completely that it feels like the truth. Think about the last time someone asked you what you really wanted. Not what was practical, not what made sense given your circumstances, not what would make the people around you happy. What you actually, genuinely wanted. How long did it take you to answer? Did you answer honestly? Or did you immediately filter the response through a layer of what you thought you were supposed to want? What seemed reasonable? What would not require too much explanation or defense? That filtering is bad faith in real time. That is the moment where the authentic self tries to surface and the constructed self shuts it down before anyone has to see it. Sartre believed that this filtering, this constant self-censorship in the direction of social acceptability, was one of the primary sources of human suffering. Not because authenticity is always comfortable, but because the gap between who you actually are and who you are performing yourself to be creates a tension that cannot be resolved by making the performance more convincing. The only resolution is to close the gap. To bring the performance and the reality into alignment. To become, as much as possible, the same person in every room you enter. This idea connects directly to Sartre's concept of the gaze, the look, the regard of the other. Sartre argued that the presence of another consciousness fundamentally changes your experience of yourself. When you are alone, you exist in a kind of pure freedom. You're simply what you're doing in that moment, without definition, without category. But the moment another person looks at you, you become an object in their world. You become something they are perceiving and judging and placing into categories. And the most powerful thing about that gaze is that it threatens to define you, to fix you, to turn you from a free consciousness into a thing with a label. And the response most people have to that threat is not to resist the definition but to manage it. To perform in a way that controls which definition gets applied. To shape the perception before the perception shapes you. To become, in other words, what you think other people need you to be before they can decide what you are. This is the social dimension of bad faith, and it is where the concepts of comparison, people-pleasing and validation-seeking all find their philosophical root. When you compare yourself to others, you're accepting their life as the standard by which yours should be measured. You're giving their gaze the power to define what success looks like for you. When you people-please, you're managing the gaze before it can land. You are preemptively becoming whatever will produce the most favourable judgment. When you seek validation, you are asking someone else's perception to confirm what you cannot confirm for yourself. All three are ways of outsourcing the construction of your identity to forces outside of you. All three are forms of bad faith, and all three in Sartre's framework are fundamentally unnecessary. Because the gaze of the other only has the power to define you that you allow it to have. Sartre's answer to bad faith was a concept he called authenticity. And it is important to understand what he meant by that word, because it is not what the self-help world has turned it into. Authenticity in Sartre's philosophy is not about finding your true self and expressing it. It is not about discovering some pure, essential version of you that was always there waiting to be uncovered. That would contradict everything else he believed. There is no pre-given true self to find. There is only consciousness and the choices it makes. Authenticity for Sartre means acknowledging your freedom, fully, without the protective fiction of bad faith. It means accepting that you are the author of your life, that your choices are your choices, that the roles you play are roles you chose, and that at any moment you could choose differently. It means taking full responsibility for who you are without blaming your past, your upbringing, your circumstances, or other people's expectations. This sounds simple. It is one of the most difficult things a human being can attempt. Because the moment you genuinely accept that you are free, you also accept that you are responsible. Completely. For everything. And that responsibility is a weight that most people will do almost anything to avoid. But Sartre believed that avoiding it was always more costly than bearing it. Because the person living in bad faith, the person who has outsourced their identity to other people's expectations, always pays a price. Not in dramatic suffering necessarily, but in the quiet, persistent feeling that the life they are living is not quite theirs, that the person showing up in their relationships, their work, their daily interactions, is a version of themselves they constructed for other people, rather than one they chose for themselves. That feeling is the signal, the constant low-grade dissatisfaction of a life lived in bad faith, the sense that something is off without being able to name exactly what, the exhaustion of maintaining performances for audiences who never asked for them, the loneliness of being surrounded by people who know the constructed self intimately and have no idea who is underneath it. Sartre lived what he preached to an unusual degree for a philosopher. He refused the Nobel Prize for Literature in 1964, stating that he did not want to be institutionalized by an award. He lived without traditional structures, without the kind of fixed social roles most people organize their lives around. He was famously nonconformist in his relationships, his politics, his public positions, and his personal life. Not because nonconformity was an end in itself, but because he was deeply suspicious of any external framework that threatened to define him before he could define himself. He was not always consistent. He was not always right. His political positions during the 20th century were sometimes indefensible in retrospect. He was a complicated and contradictory person who did not always live up to his own philosophical standards. But the core of what he built, the idea that you are radically free, that bad faith is a choice, that authenticity demands the courage to acknowledge that freedom fully has outlasted everything else, and grown more relevant with every generation that has tried to find itself inside the noise of other people's expectations. So what does this mean in practice? How does understanding bad faith and authenticity actually change the way you move through your life? It starts with the most uncomfortable question Sartre's philosophy asks. Where in your life are you performing? Not where are you adapting, not where are you being considerate of others, but where are you actively suppressing who you are and what you want in order to maintain a version of yourself that someone else finds acceptable? It might be a relationship where you have been agreeable for so long that you have forgotten what you actually think. It might be a career that was chosen to satisfy someone else's vision of success and has never once felt like yours. It might be a social circle where the price of belonging is staying within the boundaries of what that group considers acceptable thought and behavior. It might be the daily performance of being fine, of having it together, of projecting a version of yourself that requires enormous energy to maintain and bears very little resemblance to what is actually happening inside. Wherever it is, the practice of authenticity begins with simply seeing it, not immediately tearing everything down, not performing a dramatic break from every role you have ever played, but seeing clearly for the first time or the 1000th time where the performance ends and the person begins, and then gradually making choices that close the gap. saying the thing you actually think instead of the thing that will be most easily received, making the decision that serves your actual values instead of the one that manages other people's perception of you, allowing other people to be disappointed when the authentic response disappoints them, rather than contorting yourself to prevent that disappointment at the cost of your own integrity. This is not a single transformation. It is a practice that Sartre would have recognized as the ongoing work of a lifetime. Because bad faith is always available, the pull toward the safety of the constructed self, toward the comfort of having your identity confirmed by external sources, never fully disappears. What changes is your relationship to it, your ability to see it when it arises and choose, consciously, to respond differently. Sartre died in Paris in 1980. 50,000 people attended his funeral, which he had specifically asked to be simple and without ceremony. There was no state funeral, no official recognition, just the people who had been moved by his work gathering in the streets of the city he had spent his life thinking in. He had spent over 4 decades trying to articulate something that most people feel but few can name, that peculiar unease of a life lived at one remove from itself, the sense of performing for an audience that includes yourself, the exhaustion of never quite being in the room you are standing in because too much of your energy is going toward managing how the room perceives you. And the liberation he pointed toward was not easy, and it was not comfortable, and it did not come with guarantees, but it was real. The possibility of a life lived from the inside out rather than the outside in. A life where the person you are in private and the person you are in public are not separated by a wall of performance. A life where the choices you make are genuinely yours, rather than negotiated concessions to everyone else's version of who you should be. That life is available to you. It has always been available to you. You have always been free. The only question Sartre ever really asked was whether you were willing to admit it. Stop living for other people. Start living for you. Not because it is easy, because it is the only honest option you have ever had.